She thought she had lost everything, trapped in a life of obsession and regret. But what happens when the truth comes crashing down? In this shocking story, an abandoned wife spirals into a dark obsession that leads her to confront a devastating reality. Will she find redemption? Or is it already too late? Stay tuned till the end. You won't believe how it all unfolds. This is a story that will haunt you long after it's over. This hook is designed to capture your viewers' attention, keep them engaged, and encourage them to watch until the very end. She sat in the darkened room, the clock ticking loudly in the silence. Her fingers gripped the worn edge of the chair. A distant hum from the refrigerator was the only sound. The air felt thick, heavy. She could feel the weight of the room closing in on her. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, as if time had stopped. But inside, her mind was racing. Her breath came in shallow bursts. The photo frame on the table caught her eye. It was a picture of them. Her and him. The man who had once been everything. But that was before the betrayal. Before she found out. Before the lies were revealed. Her eyes flickered to the door. She listened. But the house was still. The same way it had been for weeks now. Empty. Lonely. She knew he was out there. But he wasn't coming back. Not tonight. Not ever. Her thoughts twisted like a knot in her stomach. He was gone. But it didn't matter. She couldn't let go. She wouldn't let him slip away so easily. The obsession had begun as something small, something almost innocent. At first, it was just thoughts. Then it turned into actions. She had followed him, watched from the shadows. Everywhere he went, she was there lurking. He didn't know, but she did. She saw him laugh with that woman. Saw the way he looked at her. That look. The one that had once been hers. That had once been meant only for her. She had tried to hold it together. She had. But the feeling of being discarded was unbearable. Now, the walls of the house seemed to whisper his name. Every creak of the floorboards felt like his footsteps. The silence screamed at her. She was consumed by it. Her hands tightened into fists. Her knuckles white. The door creaked open, and her heart skipped a beat. A shadow moved across the hall. Her breath hitched in her chest. It was him. But it couldn't be. He was gone. Wasn't he? Then the voice. Cold. Steady. Don't worry, it said. He doesn't belong to you anymore. She froze. Her whole body stiffened. The voice echoed in her mind. Her pulse quickened. She stood, frozen, her eyes darting around. But there was nothing. Nothing but the heavy silence. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. The air felt colder now. The walls seemed to close in on her, suffocating. The voice had been so clear, so real. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. She glanced toward the door again, but it remained empty. The house was silent. Too silent. Then, the soft click of a door latch. She jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound came from upstairs. Slow, deliberate steps echoed through the floorboards. Her legs froze. She couldn't move. Was it him? No. He wasn't here. He couldn't be. She had locked the doors. She had made sure. But the footsteps grew louder. Closer. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She could feel her breath quicken, shallow and fast. The room seemed to spin around her. Suddenly, the shadow moved again, more distinct this time. A figure, cloaked in darkness, stood at the top of the stairs. The silhouette was familiar. It was him. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't listen. She was rooted to the spot. He was back. But how? How could he have gotten in? The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then a voice. Not his. A whisper that seemed to come from all directions. He's mine now. Her chest tightened. Her breath hitched. She felt like she was drowning. The world around her blurred, her vision hazy. He's mine, the voice repeated, the words sharp and cold. She shook her head, her hands trembling.
No.
No, he wasn't. He was hers. He had to be. She had to make him see. Make him remember. Make him come back. The figure at the top of the stairs shifted. The darkness seemed to swallow him whole. But the voice lingered. It was everywhere now. I told you, it whispered. He doesn't belong to you anymore. The words sliced through her. Her legs finally gave way, collapsing beneath her. The floor felt cold against her skin. She couldn't breathe. Not anymore. The darkness around her grew. Everything went silent. Everything except for that voice. The voice lingered, echoing in her mind. She closed her eyes, trying to block it out. But it wouldn't stop. It was there, inside her, consuming her. She could feel the chill creeping into her bones. Her heart pounded, each beat reverberating through her chest. Then, the sound of soft footsteps again.
Slow.
Measured. It was too much. Her body trembled, her skin slick with sweat. Stop, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the steps continued, growing closer. Closer. The figure reappeared in front of her. It was him. She could see him now, clear as day. But something was different. His eyes were empty, his gaze distant. He didn't look at her the way he used to. The love, the warmth, it was all gone. In its place, there was something darker, something colder. A strange, hollow smile spread across his face. And the voice that came again. You can't have him, it hissed. He's mine. Her breath caught in her throat. Her chest tightened as she reached out toward him. But her hand stopped midair. It was like there was an invisible barrier between them. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. Please, she managed to gasp, her voice raw with desperation. Please don't do this. He didn't respond. He just stared. His cold eyes never wavered. And then, in a chilling voice that wasn't his own, he whispered, he never belonged to you. Not really. The room spun. Her mind reeled. Her heart felt like it was being crushed. She tried to move, to escape, but her body was paralyzed. The air around her grew heavy. It pressed down on her chest. She couldn't breathe. Her vision blurred. She felt a strange pull, as though something was dragging her under. Her thoughts, her sense of reality, began to slip away.
No.
She couldn't let it happen. But it was too late. The darkness engulfed her completely. And with it, the whisper came again. He doesn't belong to you. And in that moment, she realized it wasn't just him she had lost. It was everything. The life she had known, the world she had built around him. All of it was slipping away. The walls felt as if they were closing in, tightening around her. She fought for control, for some semblance of clarity, but it was futile. The dark figure before her remained, unmoving, as if waiting for her to accept it. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The air was thick, suffocating. Her fingers curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms, desperate for something solid, something real. But there was nothing. She opened her eyes, blinking away the haze that clouded her vision. The figure was still there, but now something was different. She could feel it. A strange, oppressive energy hung in the air, an invisible force that pushed her deeper into the abyss. The smile on his face grew wider, colder. You're still here, he whispered, his voice now a twisted mockery of familiarity. You should have left when you had the chance. Her heart raced. It was as if his words had wrapped around her, strangling her. Why are you doing this? She gasped, her voice shaking. But he didn't answer. The smile only grew. He took a step forward, his movements slow, deliberate. The distance between them was shrinking. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to move. She was trapped. Why are you doing this? She repeated, her voice growing desperate. His eyes flickered briefly, and then he said, because you never understood. You never saw it. He never belonged to you. The finality in his words sent a chill down her spine. It was as if a door had slammed shut, locking her out of everything she had once known. She was left alone in the cold, dark room with only the echo of his words. Her chest tightened as the reality of it all sank in. There was no escaping this. There was no going back. The house, the silence, the shadows, it was all part of it now. Her obsession had led her here, to this moment of unbearable truth. She could feel the darkness closing in, could almost taste it on her tongue. And in that moment she understood. She had never really had him. Not in the way she thought. He had never belonged to her.
Not then. Not now.
Not ever. The realization hit her like a violent wave. It was suffocating. She had been living a lie. Her whole existence had revolved around a fantasy, a delusion. The room seemed to spin, her mind racing to process what she had just been told. It was too much to grasp. She had been so sure, so certain. But now, it all felt like a cruel joke. The figure stood there, watching her.
Silent. Still.
She wanted to scream, to lash out, but no sound escaped her lips. She wanted to run, to escape the suffocating pressure that was slowly crushing her. But her body was frozen. The shadows seemed to grow, stretching toward her, pulling her in. And then she felt it. A cold, sharp presence pressing against her chest. It was as if the darkness itself was trying to consume her. She gasped for air, her breath coming in jagged, desperate bursts. Her vision blurred, the world around her fading in and out of focus. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The silence was deafening. And then, in the stillness, she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. A whisper. "You're mine now." Her heart stopped. The words were so familiar. Her mind couldn't comprehend them. They were his words. But they weren't his. Not anymore. The voice, cold, menacing, seemed to vibrate in the air around her. And suddenly it all made sense. The obsession. The darkness. The pull. She wasn't the one who had been holding on. She had been the one kept captive. Trapped in a web of lies, manipulated, controlled. Her own mind had become a prison. She had believed she could control it, that she could fix it. But the truth was too much. She was the one lost. She was the one who never belonged. The darkness enveloped her completely, swallowing her whole. There was no escape. No way out. The whispers became louder, filling every corner of her mind. And then it stopped. The house was still. Silent. The darkness was gone. But the damage had been done. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. Her mind was a blur, fragments of thoughts swirling like a storm, unable to find solid ground. She sat there, motionless, in the suffocating silence. Her hands trembled, palms slick with cold sweat. The room, once familiar, now felt alien. The walls seemed to pulse, as if breathing with her, each inhale a painful reminder of what she had lost, what she had become. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, counting down the moments. Each second stretched until it felt like hours. Her chest tightened, her breath shallow and uneven. The whispering voice was gone now, but its presence lingered in the back of her mind, an ever-present shadow that she couldn't shake. She couldn't escape it, and worse, she couldn't escape herself. Her eyes drifted to the photo frame on the table. The picture of him. She had once stared at it with longing, with hope. Now, it felt like a cruel reminder of her delusion. She had believed that he would come back, that he would remember her, but he never did. And now, with the weight of truth crashing down on her, she understood. She had been nothing more than a prisoner in her own obsession. She had held on, refusing to let go, as the life she once knew faded into nothingness. Her fingers brushed against the edge of the table, her grip tightening. The darkness had consumed her. And now, there was no escape. She wasn't just haunted by the loss of him. She was haunted by the very obsession that had twisted her into this thing. The thing she had become. The house was silent again, but it was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a suffocating emptiness. And she was drowning in it. The door to the hallway creaked open, and she could hear footsteps.
Slow.
Measured. They came closer. Her heart skipped a beat, a surge of fear flooding her veins. Was he back?
No.
She knew better now. It wasn't him. It was something else. Someone else. The footsteps grew louder, closer. And then, as if from the shadows, a figure stepped into the doorway. Her breath caught. A silhouette. Unfamiliar. But it didn't matter.
It was all the same now.
The room felt colder. The weight of her obsession pressed against her chest, suffocating. It was all closing in. She had lost everything. And now there was only one thing left. To face the consequences. But she couldn't bring herself to move. She just stared, frozen, as the figure came closer. The figure stepped into the room, its outline barely visible in the dim light. For a moment, everything seemed suspended. Her breath caught in her throat, but no sound escaped her lips. She couldn't look away. The footsteps stopped right in front of her, and yet the figure remained still. The silence was deafening. Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms. She could feel her pulse thundering in her ears. And then the figure spoke. Its voice was low,
Cold.
"Are you still waiting for him?" She blinked, her mind struggling to process the words. Her mouth went dry, and her gaze flickered to the door, half expecting him to appear.
But no.
This wasn't him. She could feel it. This was something else. Something worse. The figure took a step closer. Closer. She could see the glint of eyes now, dark and hollow. No warmth. No humanity. Only cold, empty space. "Let it go," the figure whispered, almost tenderly. But the words struck like ice. Let it go.
How could she?
Everything she had done, every moment spent obsessing over him, had led her here. She had lost everything. She had thrown away her own life, her own soul, in the hopes of a return that would never come. She had been blind. Her breath hitched as the truth finally sank in. It was too late. She had crossed a line, and now, the consequences were catching up with her. The figure didn't move closer this time. It simply stood there, watching her, as if waiting for her to finally understand. She felt the weight of its gaze on her, like it was seeing through her, unraveling her from the inside. She wanted to speak, but no words came. Her throat was tight, constricted. The figure tilted its head, observing her closely. "You never had him," it murmured. Her stomach twisted. The words felt like knives. "You were never meant to have him," it continued. "And now it's too late." She shook her head, the tears welling up before she could stop them. "No," she whispered. "No, I loved him. I did." The figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. It was too late for words now. It was too late for anything. The darkness around her grew deeper, colder. Her chest felt tight. The walls seemed to close in. And then, as if the air itself had thickened beyond bearing, the figure turned and began to walk away. Slowly, purposefully. Every step felt like a weight on her chest. It was leaving her here, alone. Her breath was shallow, and she could feel the weight of her obsession pressing down on her, suffocating her. The darkness seemed to reach out for her, pulling her in, but she couldn't move. She had already given everything up, and now there was nothing left. The figure disappeared into the shadows, its presence lingering like a cold draft. She sat there, motionless, her body numb, her mind struggling to find something, anything, to hold on to. The silence enveloped her once again, suffocating, heavy. It was the silence of loss, of regret, of things that could never be undone. Her breath felt shallow, as if the very air was too thick to pull into her lungs. She closed her eyes, but the darkness behind her eyelids was no comfort. It was a different kind of darkness now, one that wasn't just around her but inside her. The weight of her own thoughts crushed her. How long had it been since she first discovered the truth? How long had she been spiraling, obsessed with a love that wasn't real? And now, here she was, trapped in her own prison, with nothing left but memories that stung and regrets that burned. She couldn't even escape her own mind. Her hands trembled as she wiped away the tears, but they wouldn't stop. They kept coming, each one a reminder of everything she had lost, everything she had destroyed. The house felt colder than it ever had before. The walls, once a symbol of comfort, now pressed in around her, suffocating her every thought. And then, as if in answer to her silent plea, the door creaked open again. Her heart skipped a beat, but she didn't move. She couldn't. She just waited, her breath caught in her throat, her body stiff with fear. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, just like before. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't stop herself. She turned her head, her eyes wide with dread. The figure was there again, but this time it was different. This time, the face was familiar. Her stomach twisted. It was him. Her heart raced, but it was different now. He looked different. The warmth in his eyes was gone. His expression was distant, empty. His lips parted, but no words came out. He just stared at her, as if unsure of who she was. As if he didn't remember her at all. Her breath caught in her throat. No, this can't be. Her voice faltered. Please, you remember me, don't you? But there was no recognition in his eyes. Just emptiness. The silence stretched on, and then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows once more. She stayed where she was, frozen, her body trembling with shock. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. It wasn't him anymore. Not in the way she remembered. It was as if the man she had loved had never existed. And in that moment, she realized something far worse than her obsession. She had become a ghost in her own life. A specter, clinging to something that was long gone. She was the one who no longer belonged. And it was too late to change it. She sat there, still as stone, feeling the weight of his absence in a way she hadn't before. The realization hit her harder than she expected. She had been chasing a shadow, clinging to a version of him that no longer existed. She had been living in the past, refusing to let go, refusing to see the truth. But the truth was undeniable now. The man she had once known was gone. And with him, any chance she had of reclaiming what she thought she had lost. Her eyes drifted to the photo frame on the table once again. The smiling faces of the past mocked her. It was like a cruel joke. Her chest tightened. She reached for the frame, her fingers trembling, the glass cool against her skin. She stared at the picture for a long moment, trying to make sense of it, trying to convince herself that it wasn't too late. But the image in front of her blurred, distorted by the tears welling in her eyes. The past was slipping away from her, unraveling like thread from a worn spool. She wasn't who she once was, and she wasn't who she had wanted to be. She was something else now, something broken. The room felt even colder than before, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. She dropped the photo frame onto the table, its sharp crack echoing in the quiet room. Her chest tightened again, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She stood up shakily, legs unsteady beneath her, her body feeling heavier with each step. The house felt more like a tomb than a home. She looked around, seeing it now for what it was. A prison. A reminder of everything she had lost, everything she had destroyed. Her hands shook as she reached for the door, the cold handle sending a shiver through her. The world outside felt unreachable, too far beyond her grasp. But it was the only place left. She stepped out into the hall, her feet moving mechanically, as if her body were moving without her permission. The silence followed her, every footstep echoing louder than the last. The house was empty now, and it felt like it had always been. She reached the front door, her hand hovering over the handle. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, she gripped it tightly and yanked the door open. The night air hit her like a slap, cold and biting. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. She stepped out, feeling the ground beneath her feet, the chill in the air, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She walked into the night, her mind still spinning, her heart aching, her soul shattered. There was no turning back now. She had been lost for so long. She wasn't sure she could ever find herself again. But she kept walking, one step after another, into the unknown, wherever it might take her. The night was still, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. She kept walking, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness around her. Each step felt like an attempt to outrun the weight of her own mind. But the more she moved, the more the darkness seemed to stretch, wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into the unknown. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. Her thoughts were a tangled mess, her heart a hollow ache. Her body ached with exhaustion, but she didn't stop. The world around her was quiet, but inside, everything felt chaotic. She was empty, and yet there was a strange numbness that clung to her, as if all the feelings she once had were being slowly drained away. She looked up at the sky, the stars distant and cold, as though they were mocking her. A deep chill settled over her. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, but the cold didn't go away. Nothing would. Everything felt lost. And yet, she kept walking. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The house she had left behind, empty, silent, a prison of memories, was far behind her now. But the emptiness inside her, that was still there. She had thought that leaving would fix things, that maybe the world outside would offer some kind of escape. But the truth was, the outside world was just as empty as the life she had left behind. She had spent so much time chasing something that was never hers, that she hadn't realized she had been losing herself along the way. She could feel the weight of it now, pressing down on her. She could feel it deep in her bones. Her fingers trembled, and for a moment, she wondered if she would break under the pressure. But she didn't stop. Her eyes moved to the dark horizon, to the space ahead, as if seeking something, anything, that might fill the void inside her. She reached a small, secluded park, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, the streetlights casting long, thin shadows on the ground. She paused for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The park was eerily quiet, the air thick with stillness. And then she saw it, a bench, bathed in the pale glow of a street lamp. It seemed like a simple, insignificant thing, but to her, it felt like the only anchor left in a world that was slowly spinning out of control. She walked toward it, her feet dragging, her body heavy with the weight of her own thoughts. When she reached the bench, she sat down slowly, her legs trembling as she did. For the first time in a long time, she felt still. The world around her was quiet, almost too quiet. Her breath was shallow, and her hands rested on her lap, still trembling. But there was a strange sense of peace in the stillness. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't relief. It was something different. It was resignation. She had walked out of the house, out of the life she once knew, and yet she had carried everything with her. The pain, the loss, the obsession. It was all still there. She closed her eyes, trying to quiet the storm raging inside her. But it wouldn't stop. And as she sat on that bench, in the cold, in the silence, she realized something else. The real truth was that she had never truly left.
She had always been trapped.
Trapped in her mind, in her memories, in her own desperate need to hold onto something that was already gone. And no matter how far she walked, No matter how many steps she took into the night, she would always be chasing something that didn't exist. Just like she had been chasing him. She could never outrun herself. And as the world continued to spin around her, she sat there, motionless, her mind consumed by the weight of everything that had brought her here. And somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of footsteps echoed, but she didn't turn to look. She knew who they belonged to. And now, she knew better than ever. He had never belonged to her. The sound of footsteps grew closer, steady and deliberate, cutting through the silence like a knife. Her heart skipped a beat, a primal instinct urging her to move, to flee. But she couldn't. Her body felt as though it had been anchored to the bench, rooted to the earth beneath her. Her breath hitched as she slowly turned her head, half expecting to see him standing there. But it wasn't him. It was a stranger. A man, walking slowly toward her, his face shadowed by the dim streetlight above. She couldn't make out his features clearly, but there was something in his stride, something in the way he moved that made her stomach churn. Something familiar. A cold shiver ran down her spine. The man paused several feet away, his gaze fixed on her. She said nothing. Her voice was lost somewhere deep inside her, buried beneath the weight of all the thoughts, the emotions, the regrets that had been piling up for so long. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his eyes never leaving hers. The silence stretched, thick and oppressive. Then, finally, he spoke. "You look lost." His voice was low, his tone measured. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The words felt hollow, like they were spoken through a fog, distant and unreachable. Lost? She wanted to laugh. She had been lost for so long, she wasn't even sure she could find her way back anymore. "Are you running from something?" the man asked, his voice softer now, almost gentle. She didn't answer. She didn't even know if she could. Her thoughts swirled, her mind trapped in a loop of memories, regret, and obsession. She could feel him standing there, watching her, but she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge him fully. For all the questions he asked, she couldn't bring herself to give him the answers. Because the answers didn't matter. What mattered was the way she felt, empty, hollow, trapped in a life she had made for herself. A life built on illusions, on desperate fantasies of love and belonging. A life that had shattered in the face of reality. The man took another step forward, his gaze still unwavering. "You've been running a long time, haven't you?" he said. She felt his words like a weight in her chest, like something she had been trying to avoid, but it had finally found its way to her. She didn't answer him. She couldn't. Because the truth was, she had been running for so long. She wasn't sure who she was anymore. She had built her whole life around the idea of someone who didn't belong to her, someone who was never truly hers to begin with. She had spent years chasing shadows, and now, those shadows had caught up with her. "Why don't you just stop running?" the man said softly, his voice cutting through the haze of her thoughts. She looked up at him then, finally meeting his gaze. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes, something that made her stomach tighten. It was a knowing look, like he understood. He wasn't just speaking to her in the moment. He was speaking to her heart. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. The man's presence wasn't comforting. It wasn't reassuring, but it was real. It was a reminder of everything she had been avoiding. And for the first time, she knew what she had to do. The running had to stop. The chasing had to stop. It was time to face everything. It was time to face herself. She sat there, eyes closed, taking in the stillness around her. The man's words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. She couldn't escape them, and she didn't want it anymore. For the first time, she allowed herself to face the truth in its purest form. The truth she had been avoiding for so long. The truth that she had never truly had control. Her obsession had taken root, twisted her, until she could no longer distinguish the past from the present. She had let it consume her. She had let it drag her into a pit of despair, a pit where she couldn't climb out because she was too afraid to let go. She had been running, not from others, but from herself. Her own weaknesses, her own fears, her own desperation. The man's steady gaze never wavered. There was no judgment in his eyes, no anger. Only a quiet, unspoken understanding. It made her uncomfortable, but it also made her feel something she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of clarity. A realization that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to be lost forever. The world around her had always seemed suffocating, but now it felt open. The weight of everything she had been carrying didn't disappear, but for the first time, she didn't feel so crushed by it. The silence stretched, but now it didn't feel oppressive. It felt like a space where she could breathe. She opened her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze once more. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling with emotion. "I'm just someone who's been where you are," he said softly. His words were calm, but they struck a chord deep inside her. He knew. He understood. And in that moment, she realized that maybe this was how it was meant to be. Not as a grand revelation, not as some sweeping dramatic change, but as a quiet shift. A quiet moment where the weight of her obsession finally began to loosen, just enough for her to breathe again. "Do you think it's too late?" she asked, her voice trembling with something she couldn't place. Regret, fear, hope. The man didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, looking at her, as if waiting for her to find the answer herself. "No," he finally said. "It's never too late to stop running." She felt a tear slip down her cheek, but it wasn't one of sadness. It was one of release. She had been running for so long, afraid to face the truth, afraid to let go of something that had never belonged to her. But now, she could feel the tightness in her chest begin to ease. The obsession, the need, the pain, it wasn't gone, but she didn't have to carry it alone anymore. The man nodded slowly, a small, reassuring gesture. "Now," he said, taking a step back, "the choice is yours." The cold night air swirled around her, but she didn't feel as cold anymore. She took a deep breath, feeling the crispness fill her lungs, and for the first time in what felt like years, she exhaled, letting the weight of the world slip away, just a little. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to fix everything in one moment. But she was ready to stop running. And maybe, for the first time, she was ready to face what was left of herself. She stood up slowly, her legs still trembling, her body unsteady. But the heaviness that had once weighed on her shoulders was lighter now. She didn't know how long she had been sitting there, caught between the past and the present. The fog in her mind had begun to lift, and though the clarity wasn't perfect, it was enough. The man's words echoed in her head, "It's never too late to stop running," and for the first time in a long time, she believed it. The park, once a place of eerie isolation, now felt different. It wasn't a symbol of escape anymore, but of possibility. She had come here seeking something, answers, relief, an end to the endless chase, and maybe she hadn't found it in the way she expected, but she had found something else. She looked at the man one last time. He wasn't an answer to all her problems, but he had offered her something no one else had, understanding. He had given her the space to confront herself, to stop pretending she had control over something she never truly had. He smiled faintly, like he knew something she didn't. He didn't need to say anything more. She had already understood. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows, just as mysteriously as he had arrived. She watched him go, but this time, she didn't feel the impulse to chase. The obsession that had consumed her was no longer there. She didn't need to run after shadows, after ghosts of the past. The road ahead wasn't clear, but it didn't have to be. She took a step forward, feeling the cool night air against her skin, the quiet of the world surrounding her like a protective blanket. She wasn't sure where she was headed, but she knew it didn't matter. She wasn't trying to outrun her past anymore. She was simply moving forward, one step at a time. And for the first time, she felt the promise of something better waiting for her, just beyond the horizon. The night stretched on, silent and still. The world around her seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. And that, somehow, was enough. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could just exist in the present. She wasn't running from memories or chasing lost dreams. The obsessions that had defined her for so long had faded, replaced by a quiet acceptance. She looked up at the sky. The stars scattered across the dark expanse like distant dreams, so far out of reach. For a moment, she thought about all the ways she had tried to reach for things that were never hers to hold. It was a strange feeling letting go. Letting go of the anger, the pain, the confusion. Letting go of him. Letting go of herself as she had been. She had spent so much time fighting for a love that wasn't hers, for a future that couldn't exist. But now, the fight was over. And in that quiet moment, with only the night around her, she realized that sometimes the greatest freedom comes not from running away, but from standing still. She could have stayed in that park forever, lost in the stillness, but she didn't. There was a life waiting for her outside, a life that didn't have to be defined by the past. She could rebuild, piece by piece, starting from right here, starting with herself. The man's words lingered in her mind, and they had finally taken root. She wasn't lost anymore. The pieces that had shattered into a million fragments were starting to come together. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be perfect, but it was hers. She took a deep breath, inhaling the cool night air, feeling it fill her lungs like a quiet promise. And with that, she turned away from the bench, her steps slow but steady. She didn't need to look back. The road ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like it was hers to walk. The end of one chapter. The beginning of another.